I was asked by a coworker to take a look at their Echo string trimmer, and of course I said yes. These typically don't take that much to get going again, but it really depends on how they were stored. But what they didn't tell me was that their trimmer had been unused for quite some time and possibly stored outside in a barn. At least that's what I'm guessing, and when you see what I find in and around the trimmer, I think you're going to agree with me. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Echo string trimmer, and the problem is that after a very long time in storage, it won't start. If you didn't know it, two-stroke equipment needs to be somewhat prepared to be unused for long periods, and if not, you could have a tough time getting them to start back up. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, it's not that often that I get a chance to work on the attachment version of this trimmer, and I'm guessing most consumers aren't willing to pay the extra money for it versus a fixed shaft. So after documenting all the stickers that I could, next I'm going to take a look around the trimmer and see what kind of condition it's in. And for the most part, it looks to be in great condition, aside from being a bit dirty from being stored so long. But that's when I noticed our first serious problem. After looking inside the fuel tank, I noticed that the fuel filter line had come loose. And without the fuel line connected to the rest of the fuel system, no fuel was ever going to make it to the carb. So here's the biggest clue letting us know kind of where the trimmer might have been sitting for a long time. So what you're looking at are mud dauber nests, and there's a lot more than I'm showing you right now. We'll take the engine cover off so we can not only get a better look at them, but to also remove them, otherwise they could cause the engine to overheat. Just be careful not to get these two fasteners mixed up because one of them is fine thread while the other is coarse. And with the engine cover out of the way, we can finally see the extent of the nesting, and it's pretty bad. Now, more than likely, this was stored under cover, say a barn, but a lot of insects were able to get to it, and this was the result. Now, one nest is not a big deal, but several of them could get in the way of the airflow needed by the engine, so getting rid of these is very important. So next, I want to give the trimmer a quick spray and rinse, and that's to help keep dirt from getting into places you don't want it to. I know a lot of people have reservations about this type of cleaning, and believe me, I don't blame you, so if you don't want to do it, then you don't have to. So what do I think happened to this trimmer then? Well, my guess is that the fuel line became disconnected in the tank, and when they couldn't fix it, they put it away into long-term storage. So here's the deal, I'm perfectly fine with that plan, but if you do it that way, remember to pour out the fuel and then press the purge bulb to empty the fuel system. Doing it that way will help to keep the fuel from turning into something terrible and damaging your fuel system. That means the broken fuel line might be the first of a couple of problems we'll have to fix on this trimmer. After letting the trimmer dry off in the sun, we can start the repair process, and the first item I want to take a look at is of course the broken fuel line. So it turns out the fuel lines themselves are in great condition, it was just the plastic pass-through that broke, which is kind of strange. I don't typically see these break as they're pretty tough and should last a really long time. That can only mean that someone must have damaged it when redoing the fuel lines and it finally let go after a lot of vibrations from the engine. So based on what I'm seeing with the fuel lines, I'm making the choice to only replace the one fuel line for the filter. It also turns out that without that plastic piece, the opening in the grommet is quite large, which means we'll have to use a much larger fuel line. Otherwise, if we use the regular size, there might be a chance of a fuel leak, which is not good. After working a couple of inches of line into the fuel tank, we'll then pull out the end of the line, cut off the angle piece, and then install the fuel filter. Once the fuel filter has been connected to the fuel line, push the filter back into the tank and make sure the filter is located towards the front of the fuel tank. If the filter is located in the wrong location, the carb might starve of fuel once the fuel level drops too low. And on this carb, the fuel filter line will connect to the port on the right side, but it may be different on yours. Next, we'll add some fuel to the tank and then test how it flows through the system. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line, enter the carb, fill the bulb, and then return back to the tank by the return line. And after several presses, you can see that fuel is moving through the system just like it's supposed to. If no fuel is making it to the bulb, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to start the engine. So what you just saw me do was to move the choke to halfway in an attempt to see if more fuel and less air would help it out, but it didn't. I guess I could try to adjust the carb to deliver more fuel, but I'd rather go through the carb first before making any changes. And besides that, the fuel adjustment screws are hidden under plastic caps which need to be taken off before we can make any adjustments. While the cover is off the engine, I'm also going to inspect the spark arrestor screen just in case it's blocked with carbon deposits. Remember that this type of engine likes to be used at higher speeds than just idle. And if it does idle too much, it'll make a lot of carbon which will get caught in the screen. So here is the screen, and as you can see, it looks to be clear, but to be sure, we'll move it to a different part of the trimmer. And it's pretty clear that the screen is indeed clean of any carbon, so whoever was using this trimmer knew how to use it. Next, we're going to finally take the carb off the engine so we can inspect it. Also, if you didn't notice, fuel wanted to come out of the line, so to prevent this, either loosen the fuel cap or just pour out the fuel. Now there's nothing wrong with leaving fuel in the tank while working on it, but you do have to be a bit more careful while working on it though. So if you don't think you can do that or you don't want to risk it, then just pour it out. So here's where something odd happened. As I was trying to remove the carb, I noticed that it didn't want to come loose from the engine. And it turned out to be the gasket between the engine and the carb had become soft and was stuck to both parts. I've never seen this soft type of material used as a gasket before, but if you have, let me know where you've seen it used at. So first up, I want to take a look at the metering diaphragm, which is right under this metal plate. And its job is to control fuel flow through the carb, and to do that, the diaphragm needs to be extra flexible. It does that by pushing on this rocker arm, which then moves this needle and regulates the flow of fuel. However, that's not the case here. As you can tell, the part that needs to move is not able to do so because it's hardened up over time. As you just heard, that's the sound of me tapping on the diaphragm, proving just how much it's hardened over time. So even if the fuel line wasn't broken, starting this engine was going to be tough, and even if it did start, keeping it running was going to be impossible. Next, we'll take off the pumping section of the carb, that way we can inspect the inlet screen for any debris. And what we find is only a tiny amount of debris in the inlet screen, which isn't too bad, but we will have to clean it off though. We're also going to take out the needle and rocker arm assembly, that way we can give this carb a decent cleaning. I'm not going to be using the ultrasonic cleaner this time, and that's because I don't think it's that bad to need it. If you do want to follow this cleaning up with some compressed air, that would be a great idea. Just be careful on how much air pressure you use. Once the cleaning is done, we'll then start the process of putting the carb back together. Now, if you're a bit uncoordinated or don't want to deal with this type of reassembly, I don't blame you and would just recommend that you order a new carb instead. And if you don't want to replace this carb with a cheap aftermarket one, then go right ahead and buy an OEM one. But just be aware that an OEM carb could possibly cost 7 times more than a cheaper aftermarket one. Now the purge bulb is only slightly discolored, and if I had to guess, I'd say it was only 1 season old. And because of that fact, I'm not going to replace it, but if yours is light brown or darker in color, there's a very good chance that it's going to break pretty soon. So this is a new metering diaphragm that I keep in stock, meaning you do not have to buy a rebuild kit. You can buy these individually. But before we install this carb, I need to replace that gasket that was stuck to the carb and that ended up falling apart. And without this gasket, the engine will have a tough time starting and running, so it's vital to make sure it's on there. Now, if you don't have a spare one of these, in a pinch, you could cut one out of some thin cardboard, but you will need to make sure that it's done correctly. And after getting the gasket in place, we can then install the carb and the airbox to the engine, followed by the throttle cable and finally the fuel lines. Now, I don't mind the black rubber fuel lines. The problem is that you can't see if fuel is flowing through them. That's the reason I like to use these yellow fuel lines, but you're welcome to use whatever type you want. When connecting the fuel lines, the fuel filter line will connect to the port on the right side, and the return will connect to the one on the left side. The last thing that we need to do is to replace the engine cover because it helps to keep the engine cool by directing airflow. After that, we can then try and start the engine. So it started well, but when quickly squeezing the trigger, it wanted to bog down and die. So to fix this problem, I'm going to turn the fuel adjustment screw on top of the carb counterclockwise a half turn to give the engine more fuel. So after the adjustment, it's now a whole lot better and it even runs well at full speed. So next, we're going to have to let the engine cool down and then check if it starts like it should and see if we need to make more adjustments to it. This cold start testing needs to happen several times before we can call this project done. Now sometimes you get lucky and it runs great right after a carb servicing, but it doesn't always go that way. The same goes for if you order a brand new carb. Remember, the carb is brand new, but the engine is not, meaning you still might have to make some adjustments with the brand new carb. Now as for this one, I'm very confident that it's going to start well and run great here in about 2 hours or so when we try and start it back up again. Now hopefully they're going to take better care of it this time, otherwise there's a good chance that I'm going to be seeing this thing in a couple seasons and probably with more mud dauber nests in it. So my question is, do you leave your trimmers exposed so that insects can get to them like they did for this one? There's nothing wrong if you do, but I like my trimmers bug-free.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.